Hello. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our February stream. How is everyone doing? Hopefully, you're having a good time. And no matter where you are, whether it's evening, lunchtime, morning, we're all strapped in for a very fun and entertaining conversation. I have an absolute boatload of questions to run through today, which were provided by our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters. Some very, very juicy topics in there. Obviously, one of the title of the stream is one of the topics we are going to be discussing today, amongst many things. But no, I'm really excited to be here as always with all of you. I have been keeping super busy over the past month since our last stream. Plenty to update on. You want to? Oh, well, I mean, we're not going to dive straight into the most divisive game to start off with, but I'm definitely going to be trying to get your opinions on things. I'm still getting to grips with all the live streaming stuff as well. So yeah, we'll see how things go. In terms of housekeeping, though, we've got over 100 people here, so welcome to all of you. Yeah, I've mentioned these questions were pre-planned. If you have anything you want me to discuss outside of the topics that we've run through today, feel free to throw it in the chat. I'll try and answer as many as I can. Generally, the rule of thumb is every super chat we get, I stream for a little bit longer, and I'll be guaranteed to answer those questions as well. So just as a word of warning, because yeah, we have a lot of questions to get through today. I'm not going to try and rush, so we'll see how long the stream goes. Aiming though for around an hour. 90 minutes if possible. Why is online? I think your team consists of you and your wife. Pass on our thanks. Actually, it used to, but now we have a much broader team. My wife does still contribute every now and again, but for the most part, I work with a broader team now. And so I've got a team of editors and I've got a team of script writers as well who help basically produce everything you see on the channel. We work together as a pretty holistic team, but I will definitely pass on your regards to the rest of the team. But yes, I think since we've got so much to get through, let's start things off with our first question. Right, so I'm going to try and do what I did last time. I'm going to paste them in here, and we'll see how this works out. Okay, so our first question is from Nate G5056, and they wanted to know, what was the hardest Final Fantasy VIII enemy I ever faced, in my opinion? Now, I could have gone through a plethora of the random encounters you face in the game. Marlboros obviously are synonymous, but I think I kind of figured out how to strategize around that encounter. Yes, not ideal the first time you go against them, but as long as you leave the berserk status on, everything else is fine. You're good to go. Yes, it is a very specific question. I'm actually going to go with probably a big cop-out answer, though, and that is going to be Omega Weapon. I played Final Fantasy VII, but I was never tempted to really try and do Ruby and Emerald. When I played it, there weren't too many strategy guides out there. There probably were, but I wasn't actively curious about them, and I didn't really have any appetite to try and beat them. But for some reason, Final Fantasy VIII really drew me in, and I wanted to do everything there was in that game. And Omega Weapon was one of those challenges. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to do this, but I'm not going to use Holy Wars. So I spent a long time strategizing for the fight, probably more so than I had any other encounter in the game. And this meant, having pretty specific setups. So I had Renoa with the recover ability, I had Squall with the revive ability, and their job was basically to make sure that Zell was alive and functioning as an entity, so that I could maximize the dual combo. So I had figured out the optimum combinations you need to do for the cyclical approach, and I got down to do maybe 3 or 4 moves a second. And obviously you can also, depending on the level of crisis, you can get up to sort of, I think, 14 seconds maybe. So decent chunk of damage there, and that was one of those things where when I managed to actually defeat Omega Weapon, very, very satisfying, very, very satisfying. Everyone else though, I know that people are already discussing about the divisiveness of the franchise. It's going to be a fun topic, which we're going to get to in a second. But what were some of your difficult enemies in Final Fantasy VIII? Which were the ones, or the ones specifically, where you really struggled to overcome and had to maybe strategize a bit more than you perhaps wanted to, or were required to, for any of the other encounters that you'd faced in the game, or compared to the other encounters? Curious to hear what people are going to come up with, whether or not Omega Weapon it just tops it all out, or whether or not there were other ones that you felt were a bit more difficult. Yep, seeing some more Omega Weapons coming through. Nice to know that I'm not alone. Marlborough, yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Nate. That's so generous of you. 10 memberships. Welcome. Make sure you've got a broad selection of emojis now that you can use. You've got Angry Lauren face. You've got Happy Daryl face. You've got Clouds if you want to. There's some Moogles in there that you can use if you want to. Okay. Nate, since you've done that so nicely, we're going to move on to the topic that you actually requested, which is, what is the most what do I think is the most divisive or controversial mainline game, and why? It's a pretty meaty subject. I'm sure everyone's got their own opinions about this particular subject. Can I put a poll in here? How do I do that specifically? I feel like I can, but I don't. Can you? Does anyone know if I can put a poll in engage with our audience? Here we go. Right, okay. Let's say, right, I'm going to pick, give me some options here. I know Final Fantasy VIII is a reasonably controversial one. We'll go with Final Fantasy X-2, Final Fantasy XIII, and I think, it's whether or not we put in. We'll stick with mainline. We'll discount Final Fantasy X-2. And yeah, we'll do that. I'm gonna be generous to 12. So we'll start the poll. I didn't put the question in there, but hopefully you guys know what the question is. Can I edit the question? No, I can't. Okay. So the question is, since I didn't put it in there, what is the most divisive game in the franchise? Also, a Toad Who Codes. Thank you so much for gifting 10 memberships to everyone. That is incredible. Thank you so much. Hey, Genesis 7. Welcome. How are you keeping? Thanks for checking out the stream. It seems as though we've got a pretty clear winner here in terms of what people are thinking the most divisive is. It's actually different from what my answer was going to be, so this is a very interesting thing. All right, we'll give the poll a little bit more, see if we can get up to 70 votes. Anyone who's not voted yet, get on the voting. It's a shame we can't do more options. Well, people are changing their minds as well. This is interesting. Right, 3 more votes. There we go. Okay, so we're going to end the poll there. The winner was Final Fantasy XIII from the looks of things. So my answer was going to be slightly more diplomatic than just picking out a single game, because I know that certain people really love the specific games that are supposedly divisive, because they do still cater to a specific audience in some way. So my initial answer was going to be the most divisive game is whichever game has released the most recently. It seems to be whatever just brings about the most discourse. It's obviously the one that's relevant in that time, so it's easier for news publications to kind of dive into that particular publication and feed on the dissent that has been broadly around the franchise for probably the last 20-ish years now. But it is an interesting thing because every single mainline game from Final Fantasy II onwards really has been in some way, shape, or form divisive. I mean, even if you look at how Square themselves talk about 2, for example, Sakaguchi did an interview with Tabata in the lead up to Final Fantasy XV, and he was very dismissive of Final Fantasy II. They feel as though they made a lot of mistakes with that game. Internally, it doesn't seem to have as much love. So as a development team, Final Fantasy II is a very divisive option. But basically, with the way they decided to build the franchise out, every single time they introduced something new, it was different from what the game was that brought people in. And so, I think the main difference between now and then, though, in terms of when the franchise was building out, is that Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, those games were releasing when the franchise was still growing, actively growing. Each of those games brought in huge amounts of new fans. I mean, Final Fantasy VII basically eclipsed the existing fan base overnight with the amount of new fans it brought in. There would have been people in the old fan base that had played 1 through 6 that really enjoyed Final Fantasy VII, but there also was a lot of discourse because of how much the game had changed in comparison to the 8-bit and 16-bit style and era of what they were trying to do. The difference now, though, is that, these games, 12, 13, 14, 1.0, 15, 16, they're coming out, and even 7 Remake and Rebirth, really, they're coming out at a time where the franchise is not necessarily growing probably in the way that Square Enix would want it to be growing. And so even though each new game is bringing in new fans, it's not bringing in very many. And this is what we showed with the polls that we've done, where we asked people to give their thoughts on recent games that were coming out. Final Fantasy 15, out of the ones that we did 16 and we did 7 Remake as well. 15 was the game that actually brought in the most new fans to the franchise, in terms of people that have then come into our audience. And when you look at that in a broader perspective, the objectives of Remake and 16 were to try and bring in a load of new fans, and they didn't really seem to accomplish that objective, or at least they didn't bring any. Maybe they did, but those people then weren't convinced to become part of the wider Final Fantasy fan base. I'm not too sure, but it does seem as though, because the franchise, the fan base has kind of shrunk a little bit. The division that exists where people are like, well, I remember the games from 1 through 6 and I really enjoyed those, or I remember the games from 7 through 10 and I really enjoy those. Those fans are still around, they're diminishing over time, but there hasn't been a game since 10 really that has sold well enough or been impactful enough to supplant the kind of golden era of fans, so to speak. So whenever these new games come out and they're not turn-based, or they don't have a party in the same way, or whatever it is that people want to talk about, they become immediately divisive because it isn't what that huge group of people wanted to see. And 13 was obviously one of the start of that. 12 was also very divisive when it came out because, again, it was very, very different, intentionally so. Square wanted it to be a very different type of game. But for people that had come in with the golden era, 12 was a very different style. 13 was, again, a very different style. It was, the previous games had a degree of speed to them, and you could make them faster if you wanted to with the active time battle system. And even 10 was a pretty quick game if you wanted it to be. But 13 imposed speed. You had no choice but to play a very reactive game. 15 and 16 obviously have gone very, very action focused. 7 Remake and Rebirth feel as though they hit more of a happy medium, but have been divisive for other reasons outside of the gameplay. So it's an interesting question. I mean, like, no matter who you ask, you would probably get a different answer. As we saw here, there was a majority that voted for 13, but we also saw a lot of people voting for 8 and 15 and 16, because those games just appeal to different amounts of people. And it's a very difficult topic, and there isn't really a solution for how to solve this unless they just make a new game that again eclipses the existing fan base and brings in a whole load of new fans, and then the dissenting voices kind of get pushed into a corner a little bit because everyone loves the new thing, all the new people love the new thing, and the franchise goes in a new direction. The only way around that, instead of that, is to basically make games of the ilk of the golden era and hope that they sell well enough, which they may or may not do. But hopefully, Nate, that is a suitable answer to your question in terms of what is the most divisive game in the franchise. I personally feel, I've been in the fan base for a very long time. I've seen every single new game be released and come out, and typically that has been my experience. Like I wasn't really aware of the community sentiment from the release of 7 through 10, so I don't know if there was much division when those games came out. But from 12 onwards, and even 11 really as well, 11 was a divisive game. I think I saw people talking in the chat about whether or not those games should have been standalone. But from 12 onwards, the fan base was definitely divided because they were different styles of game every time. It wasn't like they were really sticking into the same genre. They were trying to push boundaries. They were constantly trying to redefine what a JRPG was, because ultimately they were the market leaders and they wanted to be seen as innovators. Loves to grind. Sorry, I mispronounced that initially. You're saying that JRPGs are a very niche genre now. I don't think they necessarily are. There are, Persona 5, Metaphor, even Like a Dragon. There are plenty of games that are going back into that, and they're doing quite well. Are they doing as well as Square wants their games to do? I'm sure that Square would love their games to be in the 10 to 20 million bracket. And whether or not that's possible, who knows? But if you're looking at the Persona franchise, it is constantly growing. And you never know what's going to happen. There could be a game that just comes out of nowhere and explodes things. Techno Tyrant is saying that they cap out about 10 million, and that's nowhere near the numbers that COD pulls. Well, for a long time, Western RPGs capped out at a certain limit, or Soulsborne games capped out at a certain limit. Games like Baldur's Gate, they capped out a certain limit, but there are games that have been released now that have broken those limits. They've smashed the ceilings. No one would have ever predicted that Elden Ring would go on to sell, 25, 30 million copies based on the sales of the previous games, because no Soulsborne game had previously sold over 10 million copies. No one would have probably predicted that Baldur's Gate 3 would have gone on to be such a ridiculous smash hit in the way that it was. But they have. And they have redefined how people look at these things, just like Final Fantasy did when it came out. There were no JRPGs were successful, but no game had in the genre had anywhere near as much impact as Final Fantasy VII did when it came out. And for a few years, Square were the top dog. Final Fantasy VII, 8, and 10 are some of the best-selling games of that era, without any kind of question in that. There are a few games that sold better than that. But new genres came and they took their place. They became more mass market. I don't think we're ever going to see a Final Fantasy game that sells the same number of copies as GTA 5, but I don't think there's maybe any other game that's going to be able to sell that much in the next couple of years or even decade. But I think, it's just they've kind of they're still trying to find, or they're still trying to refine the magic sauce that can make Final Fantasy a game that has legs. Because ultimately, a lot of the JRPGs that are around now, they don't necessarily have massive launches, but they sell over time. Persona 5 is lots and lots of residual sales coming in, tons of residual sales. Even it's not a JRPG specifically, but Nier Automata has done the same thing. That's very, very it's creeped up over time, and Square needs to try and figure out how they can do that with Final Fantasy, because generally what happens is that they release a new game, the prestige of the brand, the reputation of the brand enables it to sell a decent amount day one because if there's so much hype, they do spend a lot of money on marketing. But then after the games come out, the division that happens. I mean, think about how much discourse there was about Final Fantasy XVI. The media were finding whatever they could, and even like, content creators, influencers were finding whatever they could to try and mock the game, to try and blame it for everything that was going wrong in the world. It seemed like, and that negativity impacts things. I can guarantee that the negativity that bred out through Final Fantasy XVI post-launch would have had a massive impact on the amount of PC sales they ended up having. There's no. It's a pretty safe assumption that is the case. And if they'd have launched the PC port sooner, which they could have done because the exclusivity agreement wasn't that long, they probably could have sold more copies on PC. But they chose to wait. That's their choice. But ultimately, they haven't been able to produce a game that has created a lot of positivity in the fan base. Rebirth seems to have slightly circumvented that. The PC launch has gone well for them. It's still nowhere near scratching the amount of sales or copies they sold on the PlayStation 5, but it has helped to push things forward for that game. And fingers crossed the PC version continues to sell over a longer period of time, and it does have some legs. Techno Tyrant, I partially agree with that. We've spoken about this previously in terms of exclusivity, and there are plenty of exclusive games that are able to sell tens of millions of copies. Exclusivity is not really the problem. If Final Fantasy XVI had launched on Xbox and PlayStation 5 and PC, maybe it would have hit 4 million and 5 million at launch. Would that have changed the long-term trajectory of the game to the point where it now has sold 10 million? Very unlikely. There are bigger things at play than whether or not the games are exclusive to one system. Okay. We're going to move on to our next question because we're almost half an hour in and I've got quite a few questions to get through. Hopefully this one will fit on the screen. Okay. So the next question, which has actually gone off the bottom of my thing here, is from Gino. And they asked, what are some things from more recent Final Fantasy games that you'd like to see implemented in the rumored Final Fantasy IX remake? Any quality of life improvements or any gameplay elements that you'd like to carry over? Okay, so I think this is a slightly difficult one because I think when it comes to these remakes, unless they're going to make fundamental changes to things, I'd kind of want them to keep a lot of it similar. So because Final Fantasy IX is a fantastic game. I still feel as though it's if you look at all the sum of its parts, probably one of the best games in the franchise. But there are some things that they probably could add on the top that wouldn't necessarily change the experience or anything like that. And one of them is obviously they had active time events in the original version of Final Fantasy IX. I feel as though active time lore was one of the better things that was added with Final Fantasy XVI, and they probably could have gone a bit further with it if they wanted to. So I think if they could add some degree of active time lore into, say, Final Fantasy IX Remake, where you can start to learn a bit more about the characters' backstories, the different nations, histories of these different things, I think that would be really fun. Another thing, just a general quality of life adjustment, make the summon animations faster, please. And also take away the requirement of watching the longer animation to make the summons do more damage. But outside of that, I think that, any other things they make, like tweaks to gameplay and stuff, would probably have ripple effects on other aspects of the game. And so, yeah, I would probably want to keep things as refined as possible, because that gameplay system as well, because the HP of enemies is so low, the whole thing was around making it fast-paced, hard, and it wasn't about massive damage numbers or anything like that. So I think it would be difficult to make tweaks without making big changes elsewhere to everything. Okay, what's next? We have a question from Jennifer Cruz who says, what thematic messaging from a Final Fantasy game resonates the most with you? Or which themes do you think are underappreciated? I feel as though, and again, this may be something that people disagree with, which is completely fair. I feel as though, even though Final Fantasy, like the newer games, have done a really good job. I do feel as though, in some regards, doesn't necessarily get the right appreciation. And this is probably going to sound weird considering it was obviously one of the themes of 15. But thematic messaging that really resonates with me is the kind of the fellowship, the camaraderie, and especially in the older games, you had random groups of people coming together, and often through some kind of adversity. And by the end of the game, they've always found a way to, or a positive way of overcoming their differences and working towards that common goal. And so the example of this for me would be three characters like Kain, Cecil, and Rydia. They are introduced to each other in some of the most extreme circumstances. Kain and Cecil have some differences along the way, let's say, but they managed to kind of work through it. You obviously got Lena and Faris who have different things. You've got Terra, Celes, and Locke who all have their differences throughout the game. You've got Cloud, Tifa, and Barrett who have clear things they need to work through. But ultimately, when the game of Final Fantasy VII goes into its final chapter, they've worked through those differences and they're now a reasonably functional team. In recent times, you've obviously had Final Fantasy 15, where that was the entire focus of the game. That brotherhood of the team, and even in 16 as well. Clive, Dion, Joshua. So that's the thing that really resonates with me. I love seeing the party go from that ragtag group of why are these people together, and trying to solve those differences and come together. And even 10's a great example of it as well. The way that party grows together, and 9, people are mentioning 9, the way the party grows, and you see the characters grow as well and learn and adapt and evolve as people. Some of those characters in those games have really good, strong narrative arcs that don't just relate to them, but they relate to their relationship with the rest of the party. And then once they've gone through that, you see how they then change, their perceptions change, these different things. And that's probably one of the things I enjoy the most about the games. And I do feel as though sometimes it is a little bit underappreciated. Okay. Next, we have a question from Vicenarian 340. Sorry, I'm trying to look at multiple things here. Okay, so the question is, what is your favorite obscure recurring element in the series? So similar to the last one, but now we're going from like a broader, underappreciated to something that I think is obscure. And this is probably going to sound slightly strange because it may not be obscure depending on when you came in the franchise and what you feel is popular. But I feel as though romance has really kind of been lost from the franchise in a long time. And I'm sure it's because they felt it was super basic and really derivative, and they wanted to move away from that. But I'm a sucker for something that pulls on the heartstrings. It's probably even worse now that I'm a parent. I want to get emotionally invested in these characters, and it doesn't necessarily have to be romance. Final Fantasy over the years has played on different themes of love. So whether that's love between two people in terms of a romantic relationship, it could be love between a father and a son, or father and a daughter, a mother and a daughter, or parents. Why don't you say parents? Friendship as well. It feels as though that kind of storytelling device or theme has not really been there since 10. They tried with 16 a bit, and they tried with 15. they try. I mean, 13. One of the main objectives with the way they changed their storytelling was that they wanted everything to be much more emotionally charged, but the implementation just didn't quite land. And 12, there wasn't really that sense of that. I always felt as though there was going to be something that manifested between Vaughn and Ash, but it just never did. But that's because I've been conditioned. There is a love triangle in 7. 8 has obviously one of the great ones. 10's got a great one. There is relationships all over 9 as well, and I loved that. And again, it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. It can be different forms of that love as well. But it just feels as though that has become less of a focus in terms of their storytelling, and it's a shame to me. But I'm hoping that it's something that they bring back. Okay. Next question. I'm not too sure. I'm going to say Arky for the name here. Otherwise, it may get me censored if I say the other version that I think it might be. Okay, this is more of a question about the channel as opposed to the franchise, I believe. So, is there a past project that you want to revisit or potentially fully rework, either due to finding more information during your other research, or maybe just issues with the pacing and/or presentation at the time? So, yes, is the answer. I've kind of been doing this over time, actually. So, sometimes we do rework certain things we've worked on previously into newer concepts and expand upon them. And one of the things where this has probably been happening the most is with the development histories. So I actually started doing the development history videos around 6 years ago, and I started first with tactics before then moving on to 7. We did 10. We did Crystal Chronicles as well. Those videos were, by today's standards, very short. They were around sort of 15 to 25 minutes. Then I moved on to doing the history of Square, which was a really, really fun project. I just felt that no one had really delved into this kind of information before in this degree. I mean, Final Fantasy VII does obviously have the oral history, which is great. That was produced by Polygon many years ago. But many of the other games, no one's really delved into. A lot of the retrospective reviews that people have done are more about the game itself. So they'll be doing analysis of the characters and the themes and the relationships that exist and the game's mechanics. Whereas I wanted to focus more on the why these things happen, not as opposed to how well they were executed. Because I wanted to go down the route of, okay, well, my main impetus really was Final Fantasy XI, I think, which was another one I did histories of. Also, thank you so much, David Austin, for the gifted membership. That's very kind of you. But yeah, with 11, and it was really nice to see that it really came across with the video that 11 is a very divisive game as well. Talking about the Division, mostly because of how the mechanics were in that game, and I wanted to use something that basically gave the developers a voice for the wider community and explained why these decisions were made. Why did they have it so that when you died, you lost EXP? Why did they make it so you had to work in a party? And when you explain these things and then you see how they manifest in the game, it puts things in a slightly different context. So, especially with the history of Square, I'd never seen anyone really do a super deep dive into the history of Square. And I also wanted to debunk a lot of the myths that have been just floating around everywhere. I mean, Sakaguchi has said so many times that the name of Final Fantasy is not because it was going to be, the company was going bankrupt or anything like that. It was much more personal. It was that, well, it was going to be his last game if it didn't work out. But the only reason they went with the name Final Fantasy is because they couldn't use Fighting Fantasy. They didn't want to use Final Fantasy. It wasn't their first choice. It was something they got forced to use because they had no other option. And they just wanted something else that had 2 Fs in there as an alliteration. And they were like, well, we need to have fantasy. And we can't use fighting. Well, final sounds okay. Let's go with that. that's pretty much it doesn't sound anywhere near as romantic or anything like that. And Sakaguchi has tried so many times over the years to correct people whenever he gets asked this, but it still seems to be swirling around. So I wanted to use these videos to explain a lot more about the truth in terms of what happened and all these different things. And over time, I feel as though I've got much better with my research. I feel as though I've got better with how I dive into the topics and then explain it and introduce it to people. And I think it's, in some ways quite miraculous that whereas a lot of the a lot of the retrospectives out there are reasonably long. My videos are 1 to 2 hours long, and I don't really talk about the actual gameplay, or I don't talk about the game itself. I just talk about how it was made, why it was made, some of the people involved, how well the launch was in comparison to other things. What did this mean for the company at the time? And it's a very unique perspective. I don't think anyone else is really. Yes, it's very niche. And yeah, like the first Final Fantasy 1 through 3, I was definitely able to incorporate elements of the history of Square. But if you watch them side by side, you'll notice that whereas I mean, the history of Square is a very detailed project in itself, but I then took that even further when working on Final Fantasy 1 through 3. And actually, with the way they were structured back then, there were a lot of things from the Final Fantasy 1 through 3 documentaries that I actually didn't include because I thought they were going to get too long. There were other kind of chapters that I put in there or that I could have delved further into in a bit more detail. And I chose to just kind of keep those or hold those back a little bit because I just didn't think it was that relevant. But there are definitely things that could be put out there. Yeah, I mean, it may be an extra sort of 10 or 20 minutes of content. I remember, actually, I've got notes. Let me see if I can pull one of the notes from the first documentary. So in Final Fantasy 1, I had a note. Where is it? In the Dragon Quest subchapter, for example, we were talking a lot about that in terms of inspirations. But one of the games that actually did inspire Dragon Quest itself was Questron, which I didn't talk about too much in the video, but I could have done. So Questron was another very similar game that Yuji Horii had spoken about as being a huge inspiration to Dragon Quest. Most of the time, though, people just talk about Wizardry and Ultima, but Questron is a lesser-known game. So I thought, I wanted to focus on some degree of like path. But Questron was something I could have talked about a bit more. What other things that I had in here? There were a couple of times where I what other things that I could have done? I've talked about this a little bit more in some of the other videos, but I was going to talk a bit more in the first video about the lack of support for Final Fantasy in the Japanese media, and how basically there was a ton of bias because of Dragon Quest and the relationship that Yuji Horii had with the publications around the time. What else have we got here? I color-coded notes in the same color as revisions, which was super smart of me. Okay, I actually ignore me. I had a whole thing of that thing I was going to talk about. So yes, in terms of the first chapter, we were talking about Dragon Quest. I was going to go more deeper on Wizardry, Ultima. I was going to do more a deep dive in Zelda as well in terms of an inspiration for Final Fantasy, mainly because of how I talked about it briefly in the video, but about how a lot of franchises around that time were being very iterative to reduce risk. But obviously Zelda 2 was completely the opposite of that. I was going to introduce a lot of stuff about Kawazu and Nasir, Shibuya was potentially in this one, but I've worked some of those into later episodes. There was also in the launch, I didn't talk about it, I don't believe, but there was a version of the American release that actually was a prototype that was found later. Someone bought it on eBay or something. So it's a different version of the American version. So essentially, what happened was Square tried to localize it themselves, and I guess it wasn't the best of localizations. And so Nintendo did another localization themselves, I think. So there were two versions that could have launched in North America. Okay. Right. Nate, thank you for the super chat. Right, we've got another question. Did I catch the subtle Final Fantasy X post Square is randomly posting? They might be teasing something or just messing with the community. I feel as though they're probably just messing with the community, in all honesty. It's hard to know whether to read too much into what they're talking about. Ever since they took the tease to Final Fantasy XIII remake, all of a sudden, but who knows? They could be. All right. So yeah, getting back onto the topic, yeah, I absolutely constantly are going back and reworking things that I've done previously into newer videos. We redid the Ifrit evolution because obviously when we started doing evolution videos, we had a different style and format, and I wanted to bring things up to date. So super bosses was another one. We did a super boss evolution. That was one of the first evolutions we did. It has over 1 million views now, which is absolutely insane. But thematically, it wasn't in keeping with the style that we do evolutions in now. So we expanded a 30 to 40 minute video into an almost 4-hour video. So it was the true complete evolution of super bosses. And I think there were still some super bosses that people felt we could have covered in more detail, even with that. So who knows? We'll maybe get the super cut of the super bosses in the future. I also feel like I want to do some Origins videos again. Again, the Cloud and Sephiroth Origins videos are 7-8 years old, I think. My narration style and the way I talked about things was completely different back then to what it is like now. I feel as though I probably do a much better job with the storytelling in comparison to how I did back then. I feel as though someone asked about my research process. Maybe I missed that. But I basically just try and be as diligent as possible. There are especially I think now that I'm getting onto Final Fantasy VII, it's going to be easier. But the older games, especially, they didn't really release in the West, and even though some of them did, Square did no real marketing. The developers weren't known individuals. They weren't coming over to the West and doing interviews with the Western press at all. So, like it's been very difficult to try and find information about those games. So a lot of the time, it's been looking at old magazines that we've managed to find scans of, going through them page by page. Was anything about Final Fantasy said in this? Yes, no. Okay, then we've got to try and get it translated to find out if there's anything useful in there. Some of the stuff that we have found is absolutely mad. At one point, and I probably maybe I'd do a video about this. I don't know. I didn't talk about it in the Final Fantasy IV video because I thought it was a bit risque. But basically, I did talk about the fact that there was that Famitsu started up a dedicated Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest column in their magazine for a while, but they got to a point where they didn't have anything to talk about between the release of Final Fantasy IV and V, and so they kind of covered everything they could around 4. So they started getting really experiential around what they wanted to fill the content up with. They asked people to mail in certain things. There is some really weird stuff they pulled in. They were like asking fans to propose different concepts. I think one of them ended up being that someone proposed that you had mechanics where you could change characters' underwear and Famitsu got their artist to mock up an image of Cecil in full armor, except he's not wearing any trousers and you can see his underwear. There was another thing about how someone wanted a mechanic where the cartridge was had some kind of haptic feedback on it and could grow hair. It's very strange. Um, I I don't. Yeah, it's going through all this stuff was very strange. It's not all winners, guys. It's not all winners. You find some things in there that is not for the modern era. I'll say that. All right, so next question from Starshell. Okay, this is a multifaceted question. What's your favorite class, your favorite summon, your favorite mainline game, and your favorite final boss? I'm gonna go. My class one is a strange one. There's the class I want to be, and there's the class I play. So I always like feel as though I align pretty well with melee classes, just straight up warrior, getting in there, smashing stuff up. It's how I generally play most role playing games. It's simple. You get a sword, a shield, something like that. You just hit things, all good. Mages in most Western role playing games, I just never get on with. I don't want to have to deal with like resource management, all that things. I just want to know I can hit something and I can evade and fine. But when I played Final Fantasy XI, when push came to shove and I was going to be locked into a character for the rest of my entire time playing that game, I chose Ataru because they're so adorable. And if you want to optimize, Tarus are the best mages. So I went with Black Mage so I could just sit at the back and nuke things. Super nice. But I always had the dream of being a Taru Paladin. It should never work. They are the weakest physical characters. They did also have the largest MP pool though, which made them slightly viable as a Paladin. But I had too much sunk cost on the Black Mage, so I never fully committed to the Taru Paladin, which I still regret to this day. So yes, I do like playing melee classes in games. Typically, hit thing with stick. But when I played MMOs, I usually went for ranged roles or mages. Favorite summon, I don't massively use summons in a lot of the games. The only one I did probably was 10, but I used every summon equally because they were incredibly exploitable in terms of getting through the game, and Seymour at the top of Mount Gagazet was definitely cheesed by summon overdrives. But I would probably say that Bahamut is the kind of quintessential one. I think his representation in 16 was great as well. Mainline game, before I started the channel, it probably would have been 7. But since the channel has grown and I've covered the games in a lot more detail, 10 has grown to be my favorite. I think the way the story was crafted and delivered is probably one of the best. I think the characters in that game have incredible development, and I think also learning, I mean, like Final Fantasy VII had its struggles. Obviously, there was the first 3D game they had to work with, and they had a very short turnaround time while having to learn a ton of new technology. But learning about how much trouble they had with 10, and like 10 was really in many ways a precursor to what ended up happening for pretty much every single mainline Final Fantasy after that in terms of tumultuous development cycles, all those different things. But 10, they had the tumultuous development cycle, and the game was slightly delayed, but ultimately they did still manage to get the game out in like under 2 years, which is pretty commendable considering they'd never worked with the PlayStation 2 before. They added voice acting. It was they went away from pre-rendered backgrounds. Like there was so much change in that game. And yeah, a ton of respect for how they delivered that product. Favorite final boss is probably going to be Sephiroth, purely because outside of Kefka, I guess Arden, a lot of the final bosses are just hey guys, you have no idea who I am, but I'm here to ruin your day. And so it's hard to get too emotionally invested in final bosses um, outside of those ones. And I think Sephiroth had probably the best in the original game, at least. Still kind of undecided on remake. But I think Sephiroth in the original game had one of the best narrative arcs for a villain, very close with Kefka. You know, it's like between those two, it's hard to pick. But I think I'd probably go for Sephiroth, just because of the way that they chose to depict him throughout the game. It was very much one of those things where you don't really see Sephiroth that much, and as we learned later, even though when we were seeing Sephiroth, it wasn't actually Sephiroth. Um, but yeah, so they would be my answers to that. And yes, there was 4 questions in one. Okay. Next question is from Scott Ferguson. Also, I need to update the super chat. Don't know. How do I do this? Come on. 1. Okay. So, the next question is from Scott Ferguson. They wanted to know, what is your favorite dungeon or area throughout the series? It could be the theming or the music or the enemies. Like, what basically is your favorite? Thank you so much, Jamie. It's super chat on the live stream. Thank you so much. So, my favorite dungeon or area is, I've got 2 actually, for different reasons. The first one is the Dollet mission. And I don't know if anyone else considers that a dungeon area, but I feel as though it's kind of a pseudo dungeon area. It doesn't. It's not like a fully scripted event. There's downtime. There's random encounters you can do. But I feel as though it has absolutely fantastic music. It's got really good pacing throughout. Like there are real highs in the Dollet mission, and there are just like really calm moments. And those calm moments as well give you really good character development. I think throughout the stuff before and after the Dollet mission, you are given a perception of Cypher as a character. But it's only in the Dollet mission that you get to see a bit more. Sephiroth is a bit more grounded. He gets very harshly treated after the Dollet mission ends because of his insubordination. But ultimately, Cypher was a decent leader in that moment, apart from when he wasn't. But there were moments where he actually showed good leadership. He was able to actually work with Squall and Zell, even though they had their differences. And I think I feel as though it was actually a very good representation of him, and showing the juxtaposition between Cypher when he actually has a job to do and Cypher when he's just goofing around. And he also showed that kind of innovation that you sometimes do need. But I think it also had great bosses. You obviously had the build up to the communications tower where you fight against Biggs and Wedge, and then they just get swept aside. And then obviously after that, you have the XATM 092 chasing you, which was a fantastic conclusion with, depending on how you see that out, you can have Quistis on the guns, just absolutely pasting it. So I think as an overall set piece area dungeon thing, it was probably one of my favorites. Outside of that, I would probably say Zanarkand in Final Fantasy X. Again, the music was really good. You have Someday the Dream Will End playing. It's like super chill, really relaxing, calm piece. But I liked how it went to the full narrative circle. It's where you get to see the opening sequence play out, but now you have the full context about what that scene actually means to people. And I really like the setting as well. I really love that when you go through that bit, you see the kind of the faith in a very different representation compared to what you'd seen before. And the dungeon can be slightly annoying as annoying enemies. I didn't mind the actual trial as well at the end of Zanarkand. I thought it was decent. But yeah, that was probably going to be my kind of two favorite areas. Okay, Barry, I don't know if you're here. This is not specifically a Final Fantasy question, but Barry wanted to know, what is my guilty pleasure game that I don't like to admit, but you enjoy for whatever reason? I mean, if we were doing this as a Final Fantasy specific, I would probably pick the two that are Crystal Chronicles, and everyone's going to begrudge me for saying this, especially considering my review. Stranger Paradise. Um, I Stranger Paradise is probably the weirdest game I think I've ever played in my life. Uh, in terms of I don't particularly like the game, but I still got the platinum trophy. I did uh the first DLC and a large chunk of the second DLC before I finally called it quits. And I was just like, no, just stop playing it. Just don't do this yourself. Why? Don't subject yourself to this game anymore. Um, I know there's people that absolutely love Stranger of Paradise, and more power to you. Yeah, I there was just something weird about the gameplay loop that even though I didn't particularly like it, I couldn't stop playing it. Outside of that, the Warriors games. I checked my PlayStation trophies list, and since trophies were existed, I've played 18 different Warriors games. The one I've probably enjoyed or played the most since trophies were brought into existence was Warriors Orochi 3 Ultimate, which is pretty niche. I've played a lot of the spin-off Warriors games for when I used to review games. So I've played like the One Piece ones, Arslan, Berserk, Fist of the North Star. But I've been playing Dynasty Warriors since Dynasty Warriors 2. So that's probably my big guilty pleasure. And the other one is football management sims. So that would be soccer management sims for anyone who's in North America. And I've been playing those for a very long time. My first one was a game called On the Ball, which I think came out in like 93 or 94. Then moved on to Championship Manager, Ultimate Soccer Manager, LMA Manager. When I was at university, I played an online web-based game called Manager Zone, where I played with a lot of my friends at uni, which was like an actual live game where we had players you could buy in an auction. There were matches that happened every week. It was promotions, relegations. It was insane. You can become the national team manager, play in World Cups. I now play the Football Manager, as it's called. So those would probably be my broader guilty pleasure games that I always go back to. I haven't played Dynasty Warriors Origins yet. I played the demo. I will probably pick it up at some point. The super niche, probably the nichest championship manager I played was Championship Manager Italia, which was a game that was purely focused on the Italian league. Super random. Okay. Chris Hurst asked, if you could make a party out of 4 characters, who would you pick? It can be your favorites or from a busted party composition. Okay. So I've got 2 super basic picks, which reverts back to my original thing of what was my favorite job or class, which is hit things with sticks. So I would probably go with Cloud and Squall in my party. They are probably the 2 coolest hit things with sticks characters, and I loved it in Kingdom Hearts when they eventually teamed up. That was one of those real like super fanboy moments. Outside of that, I would probably go with Beatrix from Final Fantasy IX, who would be there as my paladin tank, so that Cloud and Squall can just be themselves. And I think Beatrix is a fantastic character. I'm still salty that she didn't become a permanent character in Final Fantasy IX. And I generally love that character archetype. Like I was playing Unicorn Overlord last year, and Amalia or Berengaria were very much members of my party once I obtained them. And then the last character would be Shantoto. Again, I know that's a probably the nichest of options. But anyone who's played Final Fantasy XI will know how awesome Shantoto is. I think if you played Dissidia as well, especially NT as well, the more recent times, a lot of Shantoto's humor and sass comes through very, very well in the Dissidia franchise. But it's there in the 11 as well, and she's also an incredibly powerful mage. So I'd have the two melee beefcakes. I'd have Beatrix there to make sure that they are protected and to delve out some healing if necessary. And then Shantota would be nuking from the back lines. Okay. I'm not 100% sure on the pronunciation of this name, so Owner Noah, I'm going to go with. What is the deepest rabbit hole you've discovered so far in all your research? Is there somewhere you'd love to look into more deeply? So I was actually thinking about this for a while because I found some like fascinating stuff throughout the years, and a lot of stuff that I've just never seen people talking about. And that's one of the things I really love about doing these videos is kind of telling a slightly different story than what is typically out there. And I think that the Final Fantasy IV history video was probably the first time in Western media that anyone's really gone deep into the cancellation of Final Fantasy IV. Like everyone talks. I mean, it's always quite interesting to me when you think about how people react now, and how people would have reacted then, or how people would have reacted now to what was happening in the franchise back then. So, people versus 13 and everything that happened with that game was really, really triggering for a lot of people. When they announced that Stella was being removed from the game, that upset a ton of people. But that kind of stuff happened all the time with pretty much every other previous Final Fantasy game. It's insane. I mean, no one really talks about the fact that, and we'll talk about this in more detail when I eventually get there, but Final Fantasy X, halfway through development, they just scrapped the story. Most of the characters got removed. They only kept Tidus and Yuna from the cast. Final Fantasy VII, Vincent and Yuffie were part of the game, and then they weren't, and then they kind of managed to put them back in as optional characters. This kind of stuff happens all the time, and it's people get so bent out of shape now because they have this expectation and they want things to be exactly how they want the games to be. But ultimately, games aren't theirs. They are the developers. They're the creators. They're the ones making it. And if they feel as though there's a decision they need to make, then they'll make it. But nowadays, the fan bases get so fixated on certain concepts and things that when they don't manifest, it's a huge, huge issue. And I don't know. I mean, it must be so difficult to be a game developer these days, especially with development taking so long. That when people find out about decisions being made, or it's hard not to react to it, because especially in the Versus 13 case, people were so caught up on what the game could have been, and when you look at what the game was, and it was clearly not finished, especially at launch. It's easy to see why that happens, but I think finding out these different things and really educating people about what has happened throughout the development and why they've made these decisions, what led to these things happening, is really fascinating. And so I really wanted to dive into the history of Final Fantasy IV, because I think some people were aware that there was another version of the game that existed, but I don't think people were aware as to quite how far things had gotten, or what was actually happening. Like the fact that somewhere they decided we're going to make, like they'd made Final Fantasy 1 through 3 as cyclical games, one after the other, and then all of a sudden they said we're going to make 2 Final Fantasy games at the exact same time, and those 2 games are going to be made by the exact same people. Like when you think about it like that, it's absolutely insane. Like you're asking people to work on 2 projects simultaneously on 2 different systems, and they have to be different, but also kind of similar. And I guess like the theory was that they were going to learn things and they'd be able to implement things and they'd be able to work much faster. But I still think that's crazy. And then the fact that they thought, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to announce them roughly at the same time, but we're not going to do that. we're going to announce Final Fantasy V before 4. Yeah, that's the one that makes sense because people will be more excited about 5 and it's going to be on the Super Famicom, not the Famicom. And then, like, it got quite far into development until someone somewhere suddenly decided, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Maybe if we launch a Super Famicom game with the number 5 on it and then 9 to 12 months later we launched a Famicom game with a 4 on it, maybe that's not going to be the best representation for the franchise. And like, there was stuff that I found where they basically said that they'd gone through focus testing. They'd gone through loads of internal testing, focus testing with the public. Everyone was happy with these two games. It wasn't like they were poor quality. What they were developing for Final Fantasy IV was good. And Final Fantasy V was good too. But suddenly somewhere, someone in the marketing team was like, no, this is not the way. And so they cancelled it. But I think the crazy thing for me was that, and this is kind of a lesson in general with regards to the media and interviews and things like that, and what people say, is that Sakaguchi had to go out because this was a huge deal. They had to issue statements. They were open. They had pre-orders open for these games, and they had to announce publicly through a big statement. They sent stuff in the mail to everyone who'd pre-ordered the game to say, "Yep, Final Fantasy IV is being cancelled. Final Fantasy V is now being renamed to Final Fantasy IV." And Sakaguchi had to come out and essentially try and save face, say, yeah, no, don't worry, it's not a big deal. We didn't really make much progress in the game. We were still concepting, so we didn't really cancel that much. And then a few years later, he came out and said, yeah, actually, we were about 80% through completion of the Famicom game. It was very close to being in a shippable state. And then we cancelled it. So all of that work that they'd put in never saw the light of day. The thing that's probably the most fascinating part about this whole story is that if the game was 80% complete, as he said, surely there has to be a copy of that game somewhere. Unless, I know that there is also a thing that Square, again, I don't know if there's a general practice, but they, after a game had shipped, they deleted all of the stuff relating to that game to save space. So maybe it was a case that once Final Fantasy IV Famicom was cancelled, they just went, hellfire and brimstone and just got rid of everything because there was no point to having it around anymore. But normally there is some kind of cart somewhere that was burned, but maybe it just didn't quite get to the file where it entered into prototype production phase. But yeah, that's probably one of the biggest rabbit holes I found, that Sakaguchi came out and had basically admitted to lying about the state of the game when it was cancelled, and he had to do so to try and save face because he didn't want the team to feel bad about what happened, and he didn't want to. It was embarrassing, really, ultimately. And that they cancelled. Like, imagine if that happened now, that all of a sudden. They were working on, I mean, it kind of did happen with Versus 13 and 15, but not quite to the extreme nature. Like, I guess it would have been, so, I mean, most people know that Final Fantasy 12 and 13 were being developed at the same time. And the original plan was for Final Fantasy 12 to be released in 2003. And Final Fantasy 13 was probably going to be released around but somewhere between 2004 and 2006. But because Final Fantasy 12 got into so many issues, they kept having to push Final Fantasy 13 back. But imagine if they'd have just announced 13 anyway, and then suddenly cancelled 12, and then said, actually, yeah, 13's 12 now. But obviously they chose not to announce 13, even though they were working on it for a while, probably to avoid that situation. But yeah, it was that was probably some wild stuff. And I'm sure as I go further into other things, I'm going to find some more wild stuff as well. There's plenty of, I mean, a lot of the stories are in the videos, and hopefully you've all found them interesting over the years in terms of the the amount of stuff that I've managed to pull out about the developments of these games and different stuff, and also the successes as well. I think one of the things I've been trying to put into context is how successful these games were. And Final Fantasy VI as a documentary is going live very, very soon. And one of the stats in there that I pulled out is that when you combine, I think it's when you combine Secret of Mana, Romancing Saga 2, I think it was, and Final Fantasy VI, could have been 3. Those 3 games, with inflation adjusted, generated almost $1 billion, which, by today's standards would be pretty crazy. But the other thing that was mental is that when they launched Final Fantasy VI, and I'm just going to check out the actual cost, the price here, because this absolutely blew my mind, because obviously game price is a big contentious topic all the time, but games used to be so much more expensive than they are now. And this isn't just talking about like inflation adjustments here. This is just talking about literal game price. Where is this? So when Final Fantasy VI launched, the retail price in Japan was 11,400 yen, which at the time, doing foreign exchange, was $110. $110 for a game back in 1994. And the inflation adjusted price of that, if you were to buy that now, is $234 for a game. Absolutely mad. And then Dragon Quest 6 came out and was even more expensive, because they were like, well, Square got away with doing $110, so we're going to go a little bit more expensive. But yeah, that kind of was crazy. And then the other thing that was always funny is that people harp on so much about copies of, like, sales. How many copies did a game sell? No one ever talks about how much money did the game make. Like, if you think about, like, with regards to movies, no one ever is like, oh, how many tickets did they sell? Because it's irrelevant. No one cares about how many people physically went to watch the movie. They care about how much the box office gross was. Whereas with games, no one ever really talks about how much revenue was actually generated. It's all about how many copies did they sell. And copies is something that's really easy to manipulate, because you just do mass sales. I mean, like, Ubisoft have been doing it recently. They've been selling some of their games for like $1, and they've sold hundreds of thousands of copies. You could just give the game away for $3. That's technically still a sale, but it didn't make them really any money. And with the crazy thing about Final Fantasy VI is that, yes, if you're looking at copies, it wasn't really that much more successful than Final Fantasy V. They sold basically the same amount, but the game retailed for like 30% more. So really, in terms of like the actual revenue generated, they made so much more money from Final Fantasy VI than they did V. It was like massively commercially successful for them, even though they didn't sell many more copies, because they put the price point up so much. And I like, that's the kind of stuff that I like talking about in the videos. Anyway, so what's our next question? Next question is from Christian. Christian wanted to know, do you think we will ever get more unique jobs in Final Fantasy for main characters, like we did with Dragoon, Monk, and other jobs that aren't usually for a main character? I guess my doom and gloom answer to this is that I don't think we're probably ever going to see jobs anymore. I'd like to, but we haven't had proper jobs for a long time. Probably since 10, I guess, was the last time where there were kind of archetypes. Because 12 had very loose jobs, but it was a system where everyone could be everything. And everyone in 10 could be everything as well, but that wasn't until really late in the game. Whereas 12, the license board was a lot more dynamic. You could really funnel characters down the same path. 13 had obviously the paradigms, which were roles, but most of there were some differences between the roles between the characters, but a lot of them were very, very similar. It wasn't like Lightning is this role. It was Lightning's whatever role you want her to be, and Hope is whatever role you want him to be. Vanille's whatever role you want her to be. Like it didn't really make too much of a difference. I think thematic people did choose things. Like I always had Snow as a sentinel, and I usually had Hope as my medic. But there'll be plenty of people that didn't do that, and it works perfectly fine. 15 obviously didn't have any. 16 didn't have any. 14 obviously does for sure. But that's because I don't know if they would do that if they were making an MMO from scratch now. 14 really has jobs because the original 14 had jobs, and the original 14 was basically a remake of 11. So they wanted to keep things as similar as they possibly could. And obviously 14, they have been introducing some newer jobs that are a bit more unique, but I remember interviewing Yoshida many years ago, and I asked him about whether they were going to introduce any new jobs, and his take, which was interesting considering they then did, was basically, what's the point? There are so many jobs already that I can choose from, and 14 is basically like a tribute game, so why would I come up with a new job and jeopardize nostalgia value when I can just go into the archives and pull out one that's already been used and have the fan base go crazy because we're paying reference to this old job? But yeah, I don't know with the mainline games. Technically there haven't been canonical jobs since 9, and that was only because, again, that was a nostalgic tribute game. 7 was supposed to have them, but they took them out, and 6 obviously had them as well, but it was looser. We haven't had jobs for a very long time outside of spin-offs and MMOs. I don't see them really bringing them back to the mainline games unless there is a massive, massive shake-up, which could happen. It could happen. Who knows? But I don't see it happening anytime soon. I would love for them to create some new jobs though. There are hundreds of jobs that have been used over the years. There are probably about, I think, 30 or 40 that are reasonably persistent recurring jobs as well. Tactics is very much responsible for a lot of those jobs, yes, through A2. Tactics S had a ton of jobs in it, which we never got over here, unfortunately. Hoffenheim, I will add your question to the end. Do not worry. Also, thank you for the super chat. I need to add another one. 2. Okay. What's our next question? Hold on for time. Almost an hour and a half. I've got loads more questions to do. Okay. The next question is from Oblask, who asks, did I play much Dissidia on PSP? How did you feel about it? Or how did I feel about it? And did I have a main? The short answer is yes, I did play Dissidia on the PSP. I played Dissidia and Duodecim. I reviewed Dissidia Duodecim as a critic, and I was playing Duodecim when I was in Japan for the 2009 Tokyo Game Show. That was a strange experience because I would come home from the Tokyo Game Show or back to the hotel, play Dissidia as much as I could until I fell asleep because of jet lag. I loved Duodecim. I thought that what they did with that game was incredibly respectful to the audience in terms of the fact. I can't believe they remade the original game and put it in Duodecim. That was such a cool concept. It would be like, imagine if they if with Rebirth they actually remade Remake to include all of the quality of life adjustments they'd made with Rebirth and all of the graphical enhancements, and put that at the beginning of Rebirth so you could play through Remake in as Rebirth if you wanted to. That's what they did with the Duodecim, and it's mad that they did that, and I love the fact they did that. I can't think of another game where that's ever happened. Like it's crazy they did it. Obviously, that did the new characters in as well. I don't I don't remember who I specifically played as though. I feel as though I played as Lightning quite a lot. I think she was the default character as well, which is probably why. That's a question though. How many? Oh, let's do a poll. Let's do a poll. It's hard to type and talk at the same time, so I'm going to try my best here. Okay, poll is going. I actually had to remember to add a question this time. How many of you played Dissidia on PSP? Did you play the OG only? Did you play Duodecim, or did you play both? One of the actually interesting things from the big survey we did last year, where we asked people to rank the games, was that Duodecim did come up as a higher rated game than the original Dissidia. And but the other thing that was interesting is that I don't know if many people know this, but even though Duodecim was a much better game than Dissidia because of all the content, the quality of life adjustments they'd made, the extra characters, the what if you didn't play either? You could just not vote. Come on. But no. Where was I going with that? Where was I going? What was I saying? Oh, the Duodecim sold a lot worse than Dissidia, unfortunately, and that was reflected in the poll, or the survey, because a lot less people gave their opinions about Duodecim than they did the original game. And it's also being shown in this poll as well, I guess. So I do have some fun stories though about Dissidia outside of the fact that I was playing Duodecim in Tokyo. The other thing was that the original Dissidia was actually the first time I ever worked in any kind of capacity with Square Enix because I got invited to the press tour, and I'd never really done anything like this before. I got invited to Square Enix hosted. They hired out some rooms in the Dorchester Hotel in London, which is a very very exclusive ritzy hotel. And they had in one room, canapes and Dissidia set up to play, and then in the other room is where they were doing interviews. And I got to interview Yoshinori Kitase and Takeshi Arakawa as part of the development, to ask them about development and everything. And I always remember it because I had to share the interview with someone else, which I wasn't prepared for. So I'd gone in with I don't know, I'd written down 20 questions as like this super fan. I was going to go in really detailed and deep into the game and show them my expert knowledge. Like, I'm well aware of Dissidia. I know it's been out in Japan for a while, etc., etc. The person I shared the interview with was the complete opposite. They were representing a very broad publication. And I was kind of taken aback a bit because their first question, and I looked it up in preparation for this, their first question was, can you give us a quick summary about what Dissidia is? Because there's people in the UK who probably aren't familiar with this game. And I was just like, okay. Not the kind of question I've got. Absolutely not. I was just like, so who in the development team came up with the game? Like, who was the creative driving force behind this game? You know, how did the game come to be? What was the inception point? How long was development? How long did you spend on specific aspects of development? And then I was also asking stuff like, I noticed that Shantoto and Gabranth were the last characters announced. This is because they were last minute additions where they always planned to be in the roster. What character did they like playing as the most? I was even asking about whether or not the Japanese PP codes were going to work in the English version. What were the major differences between the Japanese and overseas version, because they like to do international versions. And then my final question, which kind of had them just go like, who is this guy? Was I asked them a question about a quote that Nomura had made in the Dissidia Ultimania, and they were just like, why is he asking us this? What? So it was fun. I I had a lot of fun with that interview. Yeah, it was very much peanut and tuna, chalk and cheese in terms of the person I was sharing it with. Um, but I got them to talk about so much stuff. I think it's from my interview. Like if you like go on Wikipedia, I will probably not be referencing any of it, but um, they talked about how they spent 2 years on the combat and 1 year on the story and the RPG elements. Arakawa's favorite character was Bart, but he loved playing as Firinel because he found it easier to cheese people. They said that actually, yes, Shantoto and Gabranth were the last characters they decided upon adding to the game, because they were the more recent additions, and they had to get a lot more feedback from the development teams as to what they should put in there. The PP codes from the Japanese game weren't going to work in the English version, and the question about Nomura was in relation to the future of the franchise, and he teased, as Nomura likes to do, that they wanted to franchise this game, and so I said, are you going to officially confirm that you want to make a sequel? And if so, what needs to happen for that to take place? They gave me a pretty generic answer of like, people need to buy the game, obviously. But they did confirm that, yeah, they really wanted Dissidia to become a thing that was recurring, that they could build up the story with and keep building out over time, which, they did with Geodesza, and I'm really thankful for that. But obviously after that, Opera Omnia was a really good game in terms of like character representation and fun. Obviously, it didn't have it's ended now, and NT's a game. NT is a game. Okay, so thank you so much, Shazaz. I try my best. I try my best. Okay. Actually, I do want to take a slight intermission here. I remember seeing someone earlier. I can't remember who it is. I'm very sorry. But they said well wishes, because yeah, obviously I did lose my job in January, and I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who's been supporting us for a long time, or just in recently, and people that have chosen to support on Patreon or YouTube memberships. The fact that we've got so many gift memberships being passed out today, and I'm really trying to make a concerted effort to deliver a lot more value than we've ever delivered before. I think hopefully the quality of the videos has been increasing as well. The stuff that we're working on is really cool. Some of it isn't going to manifest yet, but will do soon. But I think I just really wanted to say thank you, and the support that we've been getting, it really is making a big difference in terms of me being able to try and focus on this as much as possible and not stressing about other things, and trying to make this into a viable thing. I've been making really good progress on the second book, which we're hopefully going to formally announce in the next couple of weeks, and we've had some really cool stuff. So one of the things we're doing is that we are having key art commissioned for the book. So the summons, we've done summon evolutions for years. Every single game has a different interpretation of the summon. So we've commissioned some really great artists to come up with their interpretation of what these summons would be if they were asked, if these artists were hired by Square to do concept art for Final Fantasy XVII, what would Ifrit look like in their eyes? And some of the stuff we've got back is really, really cool. So they're probably going to be they're going to be appearing in the book, to bookend some of the bigger summons, and we're going to make some of them available as art prints as well, as part of the project. But I'm really hopeful that the next book is something that people are really excited for. I still get people asking about the old book, the first book. We're going to be making copies of that available in some of the tiers for the new book. So hopefully, the project does really well. I'm going to try not to do what I did last time, which was basically I get slightly scared of success, So during the last Kickstarter campaign, about halfway through, Lauren and I just said, "This is doing too well. This is really scary. We're gonna stop talking about this now," because it was getting. It was, I think we'd estimated that because we were doing everything ourselves, all production, all shipping, everything. Um, and even the prospect of shipping out 1,000 books was quite daunting. When it got up to sort of 1,600, 7,000, 1,700, it was, getting, a little bit hyperventilating. We ended up obviously shipping over, I think, 3,500 over the duration of the project. But this next one, we're just going to try and push things as hard as they can, and try and get this out to as many people as possible. If people like it, what they see, and want to dive into it. And we're a lot more prepared this time, I would say. We made mistakes with shipping and packaging last time that we tried to quickly rectify, and so we found a new packaging supplier that, and the other crazy thing is that, Aaron Bell, you just asked, where can I buy the books? At the moment, you can buy the PDF, but there's no physical copies to buy. And the primary reason for that is that we have to try and buy in bulk where possible. And when you do that, you have to assume that people are going to buy it. And we did the last time. So we did order a shipment after the Kickstarter campaign happened. And I did a community post asking people to essentially pre-order the copies. So I said, how many people want to buy this? Give me your email address and I'll let you know when it's available. The mistake there was that I couldn't then email those people. We had 400 or 500 people say they wanted one. I couldn't email them all at the same time. It got blocked. It went into people's spam filters. So I'd bought 500 copies, and after I'd emailed out, I'd sold maybe 15-20% of them. So then I was like, well, I've got 400 books now sitting in my house that I need to do something with. Thankfully, they eventually all sold over a period of time, but it was still, they take up a lot of space. They take up a lot of space. And it's... I'm glad that they are now temporarily gone and we have the space available to take up with other things that apparently we just get over time. People accrue stuff. But yeah, so this next project, we have no idea how it's going to go. Obviously, we're going to try and shoot for the moon. If we can get anywhere near what we accomplished last time, that would be absolutely amazing. YouTube's just asking me to verify I'm still me, apparently, right in the middle of a live stream. Thank you, YouTube. 1 second while I go through the verification. Okay, I'm back. Yes, so sorry for the slight intermission there. I just wanted to talk about that, and again, thank you all for your support. Okay, next question we have is, we've got a few questions left, so we've run over by 8 minutes. It's okay, we're fine. The next question is from Rargona, who said, what are some settings or tropes you'd like to see in a future installment? Okay. I've already talked earlier in the stream about the camaraderie I like, the romance I'd like to see return. I'd also like to see humor return in a big way, as well as caricatures. I feel as though they had a really good solid run from Final Fantasy VI through to 10, where the party balance was incredible. Just was fantastic. You had your typical heroes and heroines. You had the young, sprightly, annoying characters. You had the quirky characters like Red 13, Kamari, Quina, Umaru, Gal. I'd even put Zell in that bucket as well as the kind of quirky character. You also had the kind of out of touch, grumpy old guy. And Lulu also kind of grazed with that as well, as even though she was only 22, she was also incredibly mature for her age compared to someone like Waka, who was basically, I think, a little bit older than her actually. And yeah, the more modern games have they've tried. Like, 13 obviously they had SARS and Hope in there, but I felt as though Hope was annoying in slightly the wrong way, and SARS didn't really fit the same mold as someone like Orin, for example, or Cyan. And yeah, like 15, they're all the same character basically in terms of age. And yeah, they did try again with the archetypes Gladio was supposed to be slightly older, and Ignis was the more studious one. And yeah, 16, they had Sid and Byron, and like they tried to have slightly different things in there, but it feels as though like with I would love to have Final Fantasy 17 really go back to the fantasy. There hasn't been a non-human character since Final Fantasy 10 and or 12, Fran, but she's still humanoid, I guess. It's been such a long time since they've really like dove into like characters like Red 13 or Quina or Vivi, and like I would love to see those kind of things explored again, as opposed to just being a bunch of humans walking around. But yeah, like I'd love to see that. But I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to them. And again, this goes back to turn-based versus action and kind of all these different things. I wouldn't mind them being just really on the nose. Going back, let's just say that, and I know this may be triggering for some, that they do a reboot of the franchise and the formula, kind of like they did with Star Wars The Force Awakens, where let's not go crazy, let's not try to reinvent the wheel. What worked with the first Star Wars, let's just try and do that again, but modernize it slightly, not go too crazy. So they could just do a storyline that is literally, right, there's a great peril, there's some random warriors of light who just ragtag come together, even call them the Warriors of Light. I don't, just really go on the nose with it and say, this is Final Fantasy, right? This is it. I think I would be perfectly happy with that. Yeah, crystals. I mean, 16 did have crystals everywhere. They were huge crystals, they were just manifested in a slightly different way. But yeah, just go back. Like, what, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I mean, God of War did a fantastic job of kind of rebooting the franchise, but God of War 2018 is so God of War, but it's also not God of War. It's like, it's very on the nose about what Kratos is and what he was. And no one cares because they brought it back in such a good way. And Final Fantasy is one of those things where it can be whatever it wants, right? And one of those things could be that we're going to do a really modernized version of the original storytelling. We're not going to have Garland in there and all those different things, but you could have a notion of the Four Fiends, call them different things. Like, Four Fiends have been in multiple games. Like, I would love that kind of thing to happen. Also, from an aesthetic perspective as well, I think that when Final Fantasy has been at its best, it's been where it's blended fantasy with another form. So some kind of science fiction futuristic, where they have guns, cars, spaceships and stuff like that, but also magic and swords and shields. Okay. Nate, I let you put in 2 questions here. So we've got, and also 3 if we count the super chat. If you could resurrect or bring back any controversial feature or gameplay mechanic throughout the main Tron franchise, and improve it or expand upon it in the next entry, what would it be and why? So, I don't think it was necessarily a controversial mechanic, but I would really love to see them bring back limit breaks, how they were in Final Fantasy VIII specifically. The reason why I thought that is probably the best interpretation of or implementation of limit breaks, though, is that the original idea when they were created for Final Fantasy VI is that they wanted to, and again, this is going to be talked about in the 6 documentary in more detail, but they wanted to create something that was there to help players who were struggling, that's the entire premise of limit breaks. They were there to, instead of like saying, oh, do you want to go down to easy mode, limit breaks were there to help characters get through something where they were struggling. So if you were getting through fights without any trouble, you were never going to see a limit break because you didn't need them. The whole point of limit breaks was that they were something the player needed because they were struggling. Desperation attacks, though, wasn't the best implementation because they were so rare. Whereas Final Fantasy VIII, I think, just had it so well. Like Final Fantasy VII, the limit breaks are cool, but ultimately it was just a bar you could fill and you could manipulate that bar, and then you could use that limit break at the start of a fight to get an advantage early on. Like it removed the entire idea behind why they were created in the first place. And that's what limit breaks have become ever since. They're just a bar that needs to be filled, and then you can just do a cool attack. Like, whereas the whole idea around it was that it was supposed to be this manifest, like in like Dragon Ball, for example, where like the characters that getting beaten to a pulp, and all of a sudden they get this like super energy reserve that means that they can like suddenly like up the odds, and they can increase their chance of winning. Like everyone thought they were down and out and lost or beaten, and then they can suddenly like come back from the dead. That's what limit breaks are supposed to be, in my eyes. And Final Fantasy VIII did that the best through the crisis system. So basically, whether or not you're aware of this, Final Fantasy VIII has a system called the crisis meter, and what it means is that you get limit breaks depending on how screwed you are. So if everything's going really well for you, then you're never going to see a limit break. If you've got one character who's in yellow health or critical health, then there is a chance of limit breaks appearing. And then if you've got two characters in low health, the chance increases. If you've got three characters, the chance increases more. If you've got certain negative status effects, it increases more. If a character is dead, it increases more. So, and then not only is that the case in terms of it increases the probability of a limit break occurring for you, the other thing is that depending on how bad the fight is going, the limit breaks would also vary in power. So if you're absolutely in the worst case situation known to man, you've got two party members dead, your character is silenced and you're blinded, and you've got low health as well, you will get a limit break that is like the absolute Hail Mary. So like, yeah, that's when Zell would get like a 15-second limit break, or Squall would get more hits on his Renzakuken, and Irvine gets more shots available in his limit break. Selphie gets a higher probability of the end coming up. Everything was based around the situation you found yourself in and trying to make you feel as though you'd accomplished something amazing by coming out of that situation. And like I love the idea of giving people that gratification. Whereas the other games that have implemented limit breaks, like, you know, including 16 most recently, it's just a bar that fills, and then you use it and you do more damage during that time, and you get a cool animation in some of the games. And yeah, like 9's system was okay. It was supposed to be really cool thematically, and I get how they did 9 in terms of the trance. It's an emotional thing that was happening, and it's triggered something in them that unleashes this latent power. But like I loved how they implemented it in 8. But Ricardo, that was the whole point, right? Is they were supposed to be random. It wasn't supposed to be something you were guaranteed to get, and that's what introduces the jeopardy. But if you got that limit break right when you needed it, that's when the game made you feel absolutely amazing about what was happening. And if you didn't get it, you didn't get it. Like it shouldn't be something that you're guaranteed to get you out of to dig you out of a hole. The whole point of it is that it's random, that you don't know it's going to happen. So when it does happen, it feels even more amazing. That's my take on it, at least. And also, I liked limit breaks in general in 8 because they're just so much more interactive and dynamic. Like all the other limit breaks are just, you press the button, they do a cool move. Whereas 8 was like, you press the button, they're doing a cool move, and you can also influence how cool that move is. Okay, we're moving on to our last question. Unless you were Quistis, yes, but also I guess you could influence based on the moves that you learned, but yeah, not specifically. Not specifically. Okay, the last question for these before I get on to the super chat questions is from Renzakuken8. The question is, if you could spearhead Final Fantasy XVII as the creative director. Which direction would you take in terms of the game's overall vibe, atmosphere, and aesthetic? I feel as though we had slightly covered this accidentally earlier. Apologies. But I feel as though the aesthetic and vibe was best from 6 through 10 for different reasons. I mean, they all had very different aesthetics and vibes, but the thing they had in common was mostly that they blended that that traditional fantasy with swords, magic, shields, with those futuristic elements. Sometimes it was steampunk, sometimes it was I can't remember how they classify 7 now. 8 as well is also of technological fusion. 8 was more a kind of like a ancient history of technology and resurgence. 9 obviously had the futuristic stuff from Alien Worlds. 10 had loads of futuristic stuff, and it was all based into the lore from the past as well, Lost Tech. Like, I really like those vibes. And 16 had it to a degree, but they didn't really go that far into the Lost Tech vibes. I think that would have been a much cooler angle for them to go down. And talking about the lost civilizations. 12 was, but it was done in a very different way. I think 12 was kind of similar to 6 in regards in terms of the it was kind of like, I don't know, steampunk-ish. Like, things were technologically advanced, but they didn't feel that technologically advanced. I don't know. That's probably a really bad way of explaining it. But either way, like, yeah, that vibe. I liked the vibe. I mean, the thing with with 12 is why I don't include it is that the general art style and direction of 12 I didn't think was as catchy and as grabbing attention wise as 6 through 10. It was quite bland in many ways, in my opinion. In terms of the combat system, for me, it either has to be turn-based or it has to be a real-time battle system. And just for clarity's sake, a real-time battle system is not action, pure action. A real-time battle system is something like you see in the MMOs. That's classified as a real-time battle section, or RTB system, as they called it, where there is still if you play Final Fantasy 11 and 14, there is still a notion of turns. It's just not linear in the same way that the offline games were in that time. You still have to wait before you can perform certain actions again. And that is relating to the entire moveset. And that is obviously abilities, but in Final Fantasy 11, for example, you can't just spam attack. You have to wait until it's your turn to attack again. And I feel as though that is a nice way of getting around it. The combat system in Remake and Rebirth is pretty incredible in terms of the evolution of the ATB system and how they managed to create that while still being very faithful to the original stuff. So it would either be turn-based or real-time combat, with still having a degree of turns in there, but just with the ability of freedom of movement and dodging and parrying, etc. I wouldn't want it to be pure action. And then, yeah, like the thematic stuff, I would like there to be much more narrative arcs relating to not just the main character, but side characters too, giving them all their dues, like a proper party set up where everyone has their development. And, that's one of the things I really liked about Rebirth, that you started to see the development of other characters coming through. It's not just focused on Cloud, just like it was in the original game. And I'm hoping that in part 3 that will really manifest and we'll get to see those narrative arcs come to a conclusion. But yeah, that's really what I'd like to see from it. Going back to that kind of like golden era aesthetic, and this is the thing that's crazy for me. Like, the golden era aesthetic, it was the golden era because those games sold incredibly well and they were also critically acclaimed. It had both of them. Since then, we've had games that have been sometimes critically acclaimed, but they haven't sold. Or they've been not critically acclaimed and not sold. And, it seems a bit crazy to me that they haven't gone back and thought, okay, this is what worked really well for us. Maybe there's a reason why it worked really well for us. Maybe we were onto something when we made those 5 or 6 incredibly successful games that are lauded as some of the best of all time. Maybe. But yeah, that's kind of my perspective. I would like them to go back to any of the aesthetics that they previously used during that era, because or iterate on some of them, because 10 was a completely different aesthetic to any of the games they previously used, but they still had very similar fusion elements to it. And again, gameplay wise, as long as there is some kind of strategy in there, it doesn't have to be pure turn-based. It doesn't have to be ATB. I mean, Final Fantasy X is obviously conditional turn-based. The other games were active time battle. The original games were pure turn-based. And 7 Rebirth is a very good dynamic real-time battle system. I think any of those work really well. I'd be happy with any of them. Okay. I think we are on to... All right. Super chats. Okay. So we have a question from Hoffenheim. How long until we get a Final Fantasy X remake? How long is a piece of string? It's one of those things where I think Square have got themselves in a bit of a muddle in some regards. And I like the fact that they've done it. We talked about it in relation to the Curious Case of Final Fantasy XIII Remastered a long time ago on the channel. Not a long time ago, it was like last year, but it's a long time ago for me these days. Where Square do not work on games unless the original creators are involved. So they have a policy where they will not allow an adaptation or any kind of work to happen on a game that has already been created without people that worked on the original game coming back. And they generally have to be very senior figures that are doing this. And I pulled out the list in that video. But for example, Final Fantasy XII, the Zodiac Age. I don't know why Hiroyuki Ito was not tasked with overseeing that. Maybe he didn't want to be. It sounds as though the Zodiac Age was somewhat triggering for him. But the people that oversaw the Zodiac Age as the director and producer were two of the most senior figures on 12 in relation to the programming side and the development of the actual game. So they weren't, the Katarzes or the Nomura's or the Nojimas, but they were like the hardcore programmers who were really in the nuts and bolts of how that game actually worked. The Final Fantasy IX, when they redid that in Unity like 9 years ago now, overseen by Itahana, who was one of the main artists on 9 and Crystal Chronicles, etc. Even though I don't think he'd ever really... I think, maybe he had directed a game before, but still, like, they wouldn't allow that game to exist or be remade without him overseeing it. Pixel Remasters, they obviously brought back a lot of people. When they remade Final Fantasy III, they had the original director and or the game designer Tanaka come back. When they did 4, they had Takita come back. They don't seem to allow or want these projects to exist without the OG team. So if they were going to do a Final Fantasy X remake, there is literally no way it would happen until the remake project is done. No way whatsoever. They just can't do it because they want to be involved. And I feel as though that may be what's holding back the remaster Final Fantasy XIII, because everyone's still super knee-deep in the remake trilogy, and they did Crisis Core Reunion, but only because they believe it would have increased sales for Rebirth. There's a bigger thing, if they do a 13 remaster right now, it's just to do a 13 remaster. There's no kind of broader ulterior motive to them producing that. There's nothing else. They're not going to be producing any 13 game, for example. But I feel it's the same for 10 as well. There's never going to be a 10 remake until Katase, Nomura, Nojima, Toriyama are all available to do that. So, maybe it's something that happens when they all leave or retire in like 10, 15 years time, if it's that long. But I don't see it happening anytime soon, unfortunately, which is strange because they teased 10.3 so much as well. Basically say that, this is something that we want to make. There's demand. They even put the audio drama in the HD remaster to try and drum up interest in producing more 10 stuff. The HD remasters sold incredibly well. Like I don't know if it's one of the best selling remasters ever made, but it has to be up there. It's sold what, like 5-6 million copies potentially. It's crazy how many copies the remaster has sold in comparison to any of the other remasters that Square has produced. And then they did nothing with that. They teased 10.3 with the audio drama and did nothing with it. And I don't, again, so it's, would you rather have a 10 remake? Would you rather have 10.3? Would you rather have the 13 remaster? Who knows? But all of those projects are dependent on the remake of Final Fantasy VII project being complete. Okay, what's next? We have a question from Motown 46. Apologies, I didn't see that question come through, but we're going to do it now. Thank you very much for your first super chat. Okay, what am I most excited for in Final Fantasy VII Part 3? You're personally looking forward to going back to Midgar and all the boss battles that the era had in the OG. I'm honestly, the thing I'm most excited to see is how the story ends. I'm based on how things have gone, I'm undecided still whether or not the decision they made around the story is a good one. And I'm not going to get an answer to that until I have finished part 3 and see how everything concludes and resolves. And I am just so excited to see if they're going to land the ending of the project and have it all pay off in the end. That's what I'm desperate to see. So yeah, that's the aspect I'm most excited about. Obviously, they've got airships and things like that coming in. The world map's probably going to be even larger next time, theoretically. I don't know. I mean, again, I'm really curious to see how they're going to make the game develop and whether or not the scope and the scale is going to be the same as Rebirth, whether they're going to tone things down a little bit, take some content back because it was potentially too much. It's going to be super interesting to see what they do. But yeah, I'm just generally quite excited to see how the story concludes with that one. Right, next we have Kevin Mohan. Thank you so much, Kevin, for the question. Kevin asks, can we start a petition to make a Final Fantasy VI TV series, a heavy drama with Game of Thrones aspects? I would absolutely love that. That would be incredible. I mean, I still have no idea what's happening with the Final Fantasy IX anime. And maybe if that one works well, then there's a case for Final Fantasy VI and some of the other properties being made into proper series. But I think it's something that Square Enix have really missed a trick with. You look at all of the other kind of big Japanese IPs now, that Castlevania, Onimusha, Devil May Cry. They've all got Resident Evil. Have got tons. They all have their own TV series where they're building out the lore, getting people excited for what's happening. Dragon Quest has its stuff as well. It's just weird that the Final Fantasy, like, they have so much they can go from. Advent Children was a big success. When they produced the anime series for Final Fantasy 15 and the movie for Final Fantasy 15, they both did incredibly well. Brotherhood was a huge success in the marketing and general lore building of Final Fantasy 15. People loved it. It's crazy to me that they haven't thought about doing something like that for any of the other games. It's mad. So yeah, I think that they should absolutely explore doing something like that. I think it would be great for them to do some kind of drama series. It doesn't have to be live action. If they could somehow make it live action, that would be super interesting. But I think I wonder if they're curious to see how the 9 anime is going to work first, if that even ever gets made. I mean, I think we covered it recently in terms of like the drama that's been going through. Apologies if we can also hear tape ripping in the background. I think there's something going on in terms of wrapping something. But no, the Final Fantasy IX anime, basically the people that got the rights to it have gone bankrupt. they are now selling the rights. It looks like the rights are going to be picked up by the people that made Blue-Eyed Samurai, but nobody knows at this point. So it could still happen. It may not. Nobody really knows. So yeah, that is is an interesting topic. Okay. Any more questions before we jump off, or is that it for today? Over 2 hours today. That's a good one. All right, I think that's probably a good place to end it then. Thank you all so much for joining. If you are wanting to join YouTube memberships, you can get stuff like videos early. So the Final Fantasy VI documentary has already been live for a couple of days on YouTube. We're also on Patreon. The podcast is back as an exclusive thing. So in the last podcast, I had a big talk about Final Fantasy VIII and my journey with the game. I'm also sharing some of the random rare interviews that I've found over the years with people. You also get videos early. And you also get to vote on topics that we're going to cover in future videos. So yeah, anything you can do to help support the channel, would very much appreciate it. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll see you in about a month for the next AMA, which I'm sure will be just as exciting and insightful as this one. All right, thank you all so much for joining. Bye.